This week's Jolt of Faith, I want to tackle a topic that we all tend to try to avoid, and that's suffering. None of us like suffering. We all try to avoid it like the plague. And when it does come, we all think the same thing. Why is God letting this happen to me? And that's a very human question. That's a very human response. And it's one we all have. We struggle when something doesn't go our way. We struggle when someone gets sick, there's an accident, etc., etc. We struggle when suffering comes into our life. And when we find ourselves asking that question, why is this happening? We need to think of the image behind me. Suffering makes sense because God himself embraced it. Jesus took suffering and made it redemptive. And even though that makes no sense to us intellectually or to our physical mind, it's our spiritual mind that needs to remember that Christ embraced suffering for us. Jesus just didn't have the bad luck of falling into the crucifixion. He just didn't have the bad luck of being scourged and tortured. Jesus freely chose that for you and for me. And what that tells us is that suffering can be redemptive. And it has meaning and it has value because he suffered for us. Jesus changes our worldly understanding of suffering to remind us that God is able to do the impossible. And Jesus reminds us in the gospel, it is only the person who takes up their cross and follows after me that is worthy of me. So what does that mean? That means suffering is part of the picture. No matter how much I dislike it, no matter how much I want to get away from it. And it's only when I realize that I'm following Jesus, I'm not suffering alone. I'm not isolated or by myself. He is right there with me because he's entered into the suffering himself. And it's interesting that Jesus reminds us to take up our cross and follow him. So that in the midst of the suffering, I keep my eyes focused on Jesus, who's already been there, who's suffering right next to me, who's carrying the cross with me. The next time I find myself asking the question, why is God letting this happen to me? Maybe I need to change the question and instead remind myself that God is right there with me in the suffering, carrying the cross and inviting me to follow him. Because my friends, if we believe, which is the core of our faith, that God was able to take the horror of the crucifixion, that broken, mangled body of Jesus lying in his mother's arms, and bring something remarkable and awesome, the conquering of sin and death, so he is able to take our sufferings, our struggles, our tears and our sorrows, and by his love and mercy, transform them as well. Not a sermon or a homily, but just that powerful reminder we all might need to face the sufferings of our lives.